all that outside of the recording. Yep, there we go. So there's Irene telling me don't forget to record. And so, yeah, play computer strategy games with the family. My son really loves games. My wife isn't too much into them. But my son, who's 5, really likes to play my games kind of with me or sitting on my lap. And he'll if you could hear some of the conversations we have, you know, like why don't incinerators have bosses, right? Incinerators are like a monster in a game that I'm playing, and some of the monsters have bosses, but incinerators don't, and he'll ask me that kind of thing. So those, you know, why don't some monsters have burst attacks, right? Things like that. So that'll be, I'm playing, it's fairly easy, but it's a lot of fun. Mike Long is enjoying it too, called Battle Chasers Night War. Previously we played Grim Dawn, and I'm trying to start to learn Kingdom Come Deliverance, which is the next game that I'm playing. So that's what I'm working on. So I enjoy that stuff a lot. I have the money and the peace of mind and the to just do that. Right. Again, I don't also need this really for recognition. I'm happy for it. I'm happy for the appreciation. I'm happy to see you guys be successful. But there's a way that I don't know, just quickly saying that can be relevant to kind of get a sense of my motivation for things. The Age of Empires series, yeah, great for learning strategy and sneaking in a bit of history. Right, exactly. I agree. There's all kinds of things you can learn with games, and of course, math is a big thing that kids can pick up with games, where they'd be like a super complex word problem otherwise, but you know, with a game, it can be interesting. All right. So today, there you go, Bryce. That was quick with a picture. All right. Let's see what we got here. All right, let's go to the slides. And so I'm explaining this overall series today off camera before I started recording. So I said that there's going to be unique distinctions listening to me. It's also going to be a little bit, I'll have structure and notes and a lot of preparation and a stack of kind of stuff to go through, but then it'll be kind of stream of consciousness as well. I don't have everything perfectly prepared in terms of, I give plenty of examples and illustrations, but it's not like a super skill of mine to put together a presentation where you're going to be like, wow, you know, like the stories gripped me or something like that. So anyway, but there's other unique, wonderful things about listening to me that you'll probably enjoy if you enjoy. So, all right. And I'm certainly going to open you up to looking at things in ways that you didn't even realize there was an opportunity, right? A lot of this series is going to be about something where it's not like people come in with a question about this stuff exactly. I'm kind of giving you the question and the answer, so to speak. So at first I'll be kind of giving you a bit of questions. I'll try to shove some answers in there quickly, so it's not too much just, you know, what about this, what about that, and so forth. But I'm going to be showing you there's a huge opportunity to be had and a huge advantage in recognizing an issue that people don't realize is going on and then having the right solution for it. And it's going to have to do, one way to start at least explaining what it has to do with is I can say cause and effect. And I've referred to this here and there in the past, but I'm going to be treating it in a kind of a coherent, somewhat coherent, but in kind of intentional way where it's going to kind of be all about this type of thing in this series. There's a very kind of deep, pervasive way in which people misunderstand cause and effect and the reasons for things. And if we think about it, how we think about reasons and causes is very impactful on a day-to-day basis. So whatever it is you think you want right now, right? Something to do with your money getting, your relationships, or something else, right? Whatever it is you think you want, then there's that. And if someone could just exactly list you a recipe to get it, then you would like that and appreciate it, of course. But there's a kind of a meta thing going on where another way to look at it is you'd like to know a set of accessible causes, right? Like things you can control that can also be reasons that combined together will get you the effect that you want, right? So if someone were to say, look, dude, you want that? Just do this, this, and this, and then you go do it and it works, then really what they did was they gave you a set of causes or reasons, right? I'll distinguish those cause and reason over time, but in common speech, they're sort of jumbled together, so I'll keep them jumbled for now while I'm starting to talk to you. But in another way of looking at that would be that they gave you the causes and reasons that got you the effect you wanted, which means that if there's something fundamentally flawed about how we look at the way reasons work to get us the effects, the results that we want, then that's going to keep screwing us up. And we'll sometimes get what we want, but it'll be harder often harder than it needs to be, and often we just won't get what we want, right? And that's the reality of people's lives, pretty much. And there is something here, there's a distinction that I can give you that it's not really a theory or an opinion. I'm going to open your eyes to how one thing is different from another, right? Which ends up being kind of a truth, right? If I can show you this is not the same as this. It's like if you thought that a group of stuff was all one thing and I showed you actually it's two different things, right? It's this stuff and this is how to see the difference. Then that wouldn't be really showing you an opinion or a theory, but giving you new distinction. And as long as that distinction had relevance to your life, then it would be helpful for the rest of your life, right? It would impact you. This is going to be a distinction like that, where it's not really going to be an opinion or theory, right? It's going to be something that's going to be pretty much necessarily true as I show it to you. And it's going to impact something that is fundamental to everything you're doing all the time. And it was the lack of having the distinction was going to be constantly, it has been making your life difficult nonstop, and it kind of is currently doing so. To some degree, some people who've been following me for a while might have dealt with this or understand a fair amount of this. But I know you guys well enough to know that just like me, who's working on this stuff, because I'm working on it consistently, there's more that if you've gotten a taste of benefit, then you want more, right? And I'm the same way. I'm fascinated by this and building more off of this distinction, so you'll get plenty as always. So what we're going to get with this frame series is the kind of basic problem is one that you are already suffering from. And the benefit is going to be alleviating that problem, fixing it, correcting a mistake that pervades all of your thinking in the background. And I know this how, because I discovered it myself, right? Like everything I discover, I'm fixing within myself. And where did my ideas come from? The ideas that are floating out there at large. And some ideas are so pervasive that we kind of all have absorbed them, including myself. But I find them in myself, not just in others. And so when I talk to you, I'm never kind of talking down to you from a pedestal. I'm working on this myself, but also having figured this out to a good degree. There's more things for me to figure out, but there's a number of distinctions I do have, and I do definitely have, and I benefit tremendously from them. And it's kind of, in one sense, my secret to success is looking at this differently. Doesn't mean I get everything right, but it means that I'm constantly not making a mistake that people normally make. And again, that mistake is a blurring of a distinction that once you see, it's going to both alleviate the mistake, and you're going to know that you have something. Because again, a distinction is great. It's different than an opinion or a theory. It's a difference that you didn't see before, and now you see it. So everything I'm saying is going to kind of be helping you to see the distinction, especially right now, right? So in this webinar, and then we'll both continue to make sure you see the distinction, and then also build on it in lots of applications and examples and so forth. So our mind, I started to talk about this recently in recent webinars, previous webinars, but our mind takes difference, distinctions, and reasons and so forth, and it turns them into objects, what appear to be like objects. And it makes us feel, it kind of processes the world as if objects had more of a reality than they really have, and as if objects can cause things, such as for us to feel good and when I say objects, I'm also referring to like mental objects and even like concepts and so forth, but that are pretty much everything, even like love and so forth, is turned into an object in your mind. Other people are turned into objects, not exactly in the way that I mean they turn into sex objects or something, but there's a way that I mean this word, right? Everything I'm saying now is going to take a little while till kind of what I mean gets translated through like our shared language, right, that we start with. But we'll make progress kind of constantly. So our mind turns things into objects, and then it thinks as if the objects cause stuff by bumping into things or by acquiring them, or like, even as I said, if love is an object, it's like if I have it, then I'll be happy. Or love is like a thing that makes two people feel stuff, do stuff, and so forth, and the cause is attributed to like that object, that thing that's like turned into an object in our mind. And it kind of, again, it takes on what we'll see as an extra level of reality that basically isn't real. There is a reality to objects as representations. So here I wrote here, so on this slide I wrote first just cause and effect as kind of a note for us. Then I wrote reasons, objects, and frames, right? What we're going to want to do is we're going to look at something that overall I'm calling a frame. Now, when I use the word frame, it's a little bit like when I use the word bottleneck. When I use the word bottleneck, it refers to a greater concept than like just a bottleneck. Like it could be a bottleneck if you're stuck on an island and you're in a car and you need to get to a different island. Then there's not an actual bottleneck where there's like a narrow thing that you have to travel through and there's too many people trying to get through it, right? That's like a classic bottleneck, right? It's kind of like a narrow thing in a bottle, and literally, right, bottleneck. And then you're trying to get liquid out, but the bottleneck slows down the flow of the liquid, right? That's a literal bottleneck. But I kind of also use it as an expansive sense, as whatever is kind of blocking or preventing you, or kind of the next thing that you have to break through or alleviate in order to continue along your path to achieving a greater result, right? And so I talk about bottlenecks a lot. Similarly, with frames, I don't just mean a restrictive definition of frames. It's going to end up referring to something other than objects that in one sense is invisible, but that serves as the reasons for things happening. And it's going to be amazing as you develop this distinction. You're going to be focusing in a way in life and understanding, you have a model for life that takes into account what I'll call frames, but that are the real reasons for the results that you get. And it's not the same as, see, what happens with objects, as I say, are representations. And the thing about a representation, it's like a metaphor or an analogy, or like even a representative of a country. A representative of a country kind of like stands for a country in a certain sense, right? Like if they come over like an ambassador. Today with the internet, it's so easy to talk to other countries, but if we imagine hundreds of years ago when you might have an ambassador go to a different country and you couldn't just call up other people in the country on a phone, right? So you're really stuck dealing with that representative, right, or an ambassador. And or if you're in today's world, if you're dealing with a representative of a company, but it's the only representative you can reach or deal with, right? Then you're kind of dealing with them as if they're the company. But to whatever degree that there's an overlap between what the representative says and does and so forth, and the country, or what the overall government of the country or whatever the country is going to do or want or whatever, then as to the degree that the overlap is true, right, or accurate or matches, then viewing the representative as the country works. And then, of course, it follows that to whatever degree the representative does not speak for the country, either because they're being deceptive on purpose or because they have people undermining them at home or whatever the reason, but to whatever degree there's not an overlap between the representation or the representative and what they're representing, then you're going to make mistakes, right, basically. And so what people do without, right, what I'm saying now is not the type of things people normally think about, right? You normally assume all this. It all happens in the background in your mind. and then you go about your life. But by having a model of the world that takes into account and is kind of rebuilt off of this distinction, then what people normally do is they make them the same person will kind of be smart in a bunch of ways and then be functionally kind of stupid in other ways, right? Including ourselves, right? In essence, sometimes we'll be like, how the heck did I do something that dumb, right, or stupid? And other times we'll be like, wow, that was really smart, or I learned that really well. Other times we don't learn things very well, and so forth, right? And one way, this doesn't provide the entire solution, but what I'm about to say, but it opens us up to a way better frame or a reason that's going to mix in that's going to make everything easier, is people, as long as we don't realize that objects are representations, and people don't, right? And the way that I mean this, people think about the world as pretty much only consisting of objects, and they take for granted that causes and reasons are to be found inside of objects, including like thoughts and so forth. And to the extent where like people will constantly be discovering kind of ways around this to some degree, but even when people talk about like mindset, people end up turning a mindset into functionally an object, like perseverance, or just being positive or thinking positive. People will, in the way that I mean object, they'll treat a mindset as like a thing to have or do, or they'll treat their mind as a whole, just like everything, as an object. And then we think that the secret to life is to basically, or the way to achieve what we want, ends up being to move objects around, to control objects. People say, I want to control my mind better. People might not use the same language as other people, but one way or the other, they want people to do what they want them to do nonstop, right? And so much of people's endeavors revolves around what to do about someone not doing what they want, or particularly not doing something they don't want them to do, or to get people to buy your stuff, right, is all a subset of getting other people to do what they want. As we start to see the world where we distinguish frames and objects, and we understand that the reasons for things is actually can pretty much almost be renamed into the word frames, and that results are like the intersection of a whole number of frames or reasons. The word vectors, when I used it a while ago, kind of pointed to the same concept. We still will need to think in terms of objects, but as you understand better and better how the object is like a metaphor or a representation, you don't confuse it in the wrong way, or over time as I continue to explain this and it gets across well, then we'll realize that we do need to think in terms of objects, but by being aware that objects only have a level of reality that involves representing reasons, but they aren't reasons. And I'm going to give you, go right away to an illustration here. I already said this next line previously when I was talking. The next line on the slides, for those people listening on an MP3, says the overlap of representations and reality makes people smart, and the non-overlap, right? When an object, kind of the way we represent things as an object, matches reality, then we functionally act smart, right? We pretty much get the result we want. Or we predict that a person will act the way that they really will act, or so forth. Or we think of the right thing to say that works. But then the non-overlap makes people stupid. And now I'm getting to an illustration that'll start to further things. All right, I wrote here cake versus pixels, just as a bit of a note for you and for me. And I'll explain what I mean. So if we imagine making a cake, then a cake is made of ingredients that are kind of, in one sense, the same nature as the cake. Like they're all kind of objects. You mix a bunch of objects together, put it in another object like a stove at a certain temperature, and you get like a cake, right? With pixels, it's a bit different, where the reasons for the pixels on your screen, right, your computer screen, the reason it shows what it shows is computer code, in essence, right? And then there's a cascade of reasons, right? The reason why you see what's on your computer screen right now is partly because of what I wrote on my slides, right? And then it's going through GoToWebinar, and then you're seeing it on your screen. But so there's first of all a cascade of frames and reasons that all play a part, and that ultimately output pixels, right? A configuration of pixels. But the nature of those reasons, especially if we just look at the computer code part, they're of a different nature than the pixels, right? Pixels aren't like made of, or the configuration of pixels on your computer screen isn't made of a previous configuration of pixels, right? In the material world, it's state dependent, right? In a certain way where the state of the physical world is some physical laws or whatever, or at least our normal way of looking at it, right? But there's an overlap with reality in what I'm saying. That the configuration of matter last second, plus physical laws, maybe plus some interference of conscious, free will and so forth, but putting that aside for a moment, leads to the next moment. But the pixels on your computer screen, it's easy to see, in this case, with this illustration, how the reasons for those pixels are not composed of other pixels doing stuff and then forming the next thing you see on your computer screen. Right? It's all code, and analogously what I'm calling frames and reasons. And in order to affect what's on a computer screen, then of course if we think in terms of code, then if someone didn't realize that at all, like if they were primitive or in some sense didn't understand anything to do with how computers work, and they were trying to, if you just kind of picture an archetypical primitive person trying to change what's on a computer screen, then you can imagine them reaching out with their hand, kind of like an iPad works intuitively for kids, right? Or for anyone, but kids like iPads because it particularly works, you program apps to work a lot like the physical world works, where once you're using an app or even the overall interface, you can kind of just drag stuff with your finger, right? Like you point at something and you move it as if, right? So an iPad is kind of an intermediate example in between the cake and the pixels in a sense, right? Where, again, it almost functions like what we might think of as real life, but where it appears or it acts more like the reasons why the cow moves over from the right to the left is because you drag it with your hands. So you're like moving it, right? So it's almost like more like kind of similar to what we normally think of as real life, or which I'm telling you is also wrong, which is that the idea that cause and effect are found like within the pixels, right, or within objects. When we're not getting, to just bring it home for a second in a certain way, when we're not getting the result that we want in life, one way that you can see that you're making progress with this series is even if you're just starting, but if you start to, instead of think, your initial response or reaction is going to involve a feeling like I want an object to move and affect some other object, including I want to say something that's going to get this person to do something. So my speech is almost like an object, like a script, like a sentence, or what people say, what can I say to get this person to do such and such? In that way, they're like turning what they say into an object that's going to move, right? The way people look at the world as objects, again, inherently cause things. So it's like what I say as an object affects this other object, like this person, and gets them to move like an object in the way that I want and like do what I want, right? So one first step is to start to notice that we look at things that way. Next step is to start to think a little bit more in terms of frames. You don't need a full understanding of frames. I don't have a full understanding of frames, but I have I have a lot of understanding or a significant amount of kind of distinctions and model that I use. But you don't need to fully understand it. You can just start by thinking in a certain way where you're like, what context might make the result that I want? Let's say in this case, a person doing what you want. Could be a child, could be a coworker, could be a relationship partner, or whatever, right? Or a prospect of some sort, right, in business. What context, what frame would make it easier or more likely to get the result that I want? And just by starting to ask that question, you'll discover more about frames and reasons yourself. Now, we will still need to represent frames themselves as an object in order to think about them. See, objects and analogies and metaphors, they have a critically important role, right? I need to, when I'm talking to you about this stuff, I need to turn my concepts into illustrations, metaphors, analogies, objects in order to illustrate them, communicate them. But what we want to be able to do is have a distinction, operate on two levels where we understand that those are representations. We want those representations to overlap with reality as best as possible, but we do that by not assuming that they already overlap with reality. Something I've talked about recently in Dimensionality, my previous series, was how people act, think, and imply and feel as if they should already have a framework for things. In other words, a similar way of putting it is that by acting as if an object already should overlap with reality, by acting as if I should already know what to say to get the person to do what I want, by acting as if they should already know what I want and be doing it, by acting as if I should already control my mind in every way, feeling guilty if I have certain thoughts or if I didn't think of something, or if my mind, whatever, right, makes us feel like we would want to control our mind better. Anything like that, or looking to find love before you understand what it is, more fundamentally. All of it implies and assumes that you should or do already have a framework. Like you already have the backdrop in this case. When I say you talk about framework, you already have like the meta strategy or the capacity to like if you're not thinking about the nature of something, but instead you're just trying to get it, then you're assuming that you already understand the nature and you just kind of need to look around until you see it, right? People do that with relationship partners, right? They do it with all sorts of things. They do it with reading sales letters for make money offers, right? There's a way that people do it coming into a webinar that I give or someone else gives, right? There's a way that you'll come into the webinar to some degree, maybe a long time, or particularly people that like me a lot or whatever might not do this to some degree, but you'll come in thinking about whether you like the webinar in a sense or whether you want to continue with the series. Well, if you're asking that question, it assumes that you already have a framework for successfully answering that question yourself, right? Like it implies that you're assuming that, and I'm not saying this is wrong or right, but you're assuming that you're fundamentally wiser than me, right? Because you're setting yourself up as the judge for whether to continue with watching my webinars, right? Like if by default a person would listen and in a sense be kind of continuously deciding whether to continue listening or whether to tune in next week. But by going straight to deciding without thinking about whether they have the right ability to decide whether to follow with my webinars, right? That people assume that. So on nearly every level, we're constantly assuming that we not only have a framework, but that we should have it whenever we get impatient with ourselves for not learning something fast enough. Then we're assuming we already should have more framework than we do. If we're hoping that someone will say yes when we give them a sales pitch, then we're hoping we already have the framework with which to, in the moment, in that time, give the pitch. A framework is not the same thing as having a word-for-word script. You might come in and ad-lib or say what comes to mind based on paying attention and so forth. But if you're hoping that something will work, you're basically hoping you already have a framework that's going to give you enough background that's going to allow you to succeed. And I was talking about objects and how their representations, how we speak in metaphors. There's a way that in life when we stop implying and assuming that we should have the right frame, and instead we see when we operate at the level of objects, we're assuming we have the frame, and our representation overlaps with reality and so forth. Our objects are basically correct in a certain way, and they might just need to be moved, right? Or they might need to be acquired. But think about it. If you want an object, like even a bunch of money, or a relationship partner of a certain type, or a business, or a client to say yes, that's like an object, the way people represent it, right? A yes, or a client. Then you're assuming that the overlap between that thing that you're getting and what's going to help your life is accurate, right? You're and there's a way that you can think about it differently, where it's perfectly reasonable to like get a client, right, or to begin a relationship with someone, or to commit to a relationship with someone. But there's a way that if you don't hope in like the wrong way, I'm trying to explain this kind of, I'm always kind of stuck because we'll have more of a shared kind of sense framework together over time. I'm doing the best I can with what we might already have together. But there's a way that if you hope that it's like if you hope, if someone's like, oh, I hope this relationship works out, or I hope this person is right for me, then we're hardening that object, which is a representation, in a way that's counterproductive. And we're not seeing past that representation to the various frames and wavelengths, some of which we can control. So like a person, a relationship partner is, people often think as if they're an object that will kind of, like people say, oh, this is a great person, or this is a good person, this is a smart person, this is a stupid person. Well, actually the people are very context dependent, which is another way of saying there's a bunch of frames and factors that go into a person's behavior and feelings and thoughts and so forth that are not all intrinsic to the person as an object. And if you seek understanding in a certain way, then you will come to recognize environmental factors that can bring out the best or worst in someone, and you'll recognize it to a greater degree. People do this to some degree already, but you'll recognize likely to a significantly greater degree how a person is context depending, and how your particular relationship partner and multiple partners in the sense of business partners and client relationships and so forth are context dependent. And instead of just thinking this person's a jerk, or this person's terrific, or this person's trustworthy and loyal, this person isn't, instead you think of it more like in the following like circumstances that like bring out this person's trustworthiness, right? Or this person's trustworthy in this environment as far as I can tell. Plus there might be other factors that you still don't understand yet, right? You always want to be open for seeing more frames, seeing assumptions you are making, right? Kind of frames that were kind of invisible to you. And be open to noticing those, right? And people are kind of much easier to deal with than a lot of people realize. There's a kind of funny thing that I wrote on one of these slides here. Let's see, oops. So I just wrote this, I'll just mention this while I come to it. I write here that people are either fairly easy to manipulate or to talk to, one or the other. This whole overall slide, I really like, you win either way, and I gave a few different examples. Like, people are on a continuum with this, and again, it's not intrinsic just to the person, but to a whole number of frames that could come and go, right? And there's environmental factors in people's lives that change. There's recent events that happen to someone to make them more cynical, or they might be in a rush, which will affect how they act on the kind of the behaviorism scale of how much they just need you to do something for them right now and how they're going to reward you or punish you for doing that, right? So again, there's a whole bunch of frames and reasons and factors that are not intrinsic to the person as an object, right? That we can see if we see the world in this way, or start to see, right? But regardless, in any one situation, and overall to some amount, and then I'm talking about where people fall on how like behavioristic they are, in terms of a person can particularly be like, I want this result from you, right? And I'm going to, they don't have to say these words, but they imply this pretty obviously, and they act this way. I'm going to reward you either with my words and tone and approval, or with money or my business or sex or whatever, and I'm going to punish you. I'm going to reward you if you do what I want, behave the way I want, meaning including, I don't mean even overall, but just do a particular behavior that I want, or I'm going to do the opposite, right? I'm going to punish you in some way if you don't, right? And when you have this kind of category in your head, you can kind of notice it. And then people fall on different places on this scale of how much they're doing this versus how much they, you can kind of talk to a person and kind of reach them and kind of discuss how you guys might do a win-win together, rather than them just having in their mind, I want you to do such and such, here's what I'm going to do for you if you do it, either implied or explicit, right? And the interesting thing is that you can get what you want from people in either case. When you kind of see things, both what I'm saying now and overall with frames, including you can just quickly bypass a situation where a person's rewarding and punishing you for a behavior if you don't want the reward. But if I want the reward, right, if they're going to pay me a certain amount of money, if I needed money, or if they're going to perform some task for me, right, if they're the soup Nazi in Seinfeld and I want their soup, right, and they say you have to get in line in this way, you have to speak in this way and say this, and you'll get your soup. And if I want the soup, I'll just do it. And you see, unless there's some overall reason for me not to, but the general idea of like pride or something like that isn't really relevant, right? When you see things in this way, then people that are, again, manipulative, they're actually very easy to quote unquote manipulate in return, right? If you want what they want, you just transact. And the way, like they're, in another way, it's kind of easy, right? It's like if someone walks up to you and says, I'll give you $2,000 a month if you rank my website in the top 3, you know, within 6 months. And then I'll stop paying you if you don't, and if you do, I'll keep paying you, right? In one sense, that's the ultimate behaviorist, right? They're like, here's the reward. Now, there's not really a punishment involved necessarily there, right? Or, I mean, if there was a risk of punishment, if there's like, say, on the contrary, if you don't rank me, I'll tell all my friends how bad you are, you know, leave you bad reviews and trash you on the internet, then you wouldn't want to get involved, right? Presumably. But anyway, if they're basically just going to give you a dirty look and frown otherwise, right? Or just merely terminate your paying you. Or maybe if they say that I expect my money back if you don't rank within 6 months, maybe you're willing to do that. Right? I'm not suggesting that or not, but I'm just saying they're giving you a specific transaction, and you can say yes or no. And you can, in a sense, you can call it manipulation or not, but you can kind of bypass that whole word and just either deal with it or not. Depending on how it's framed, people can reject that whole situation out of something they might think of as pride, right? In other cases, they'll just accept it, right, if it's framed in the right way. But you can be where you don't need to have like an arbitrary idea. I'm not speaking of debasing yourself in some way or not, but just simply in practical life, it comes up in business plenty, where someone will kind of present an offer in a way that might offend your sensibilities, but otherwise you can reduce it to a simple transaction that you actually want. And I see this pretty commonly. I also see people commonly screw it up, where they'll go with their like sensibilities, or their kind of their wrong representation of things as important, right? Where their pride or sensibilities will have like no actual impact on their life, right? Other than kind of circularly in their head, but it's not doing anything for them. It's not even like protecting their reputation or anything like that. If there's something real that it's doing for you, or if you come up with a counterexample where you're like, wait a second, David, there's a good reason for not giving in to the manipulation. Well, if there's a good reason, then great, don't do it. But if there's not, then just go with the transaction they're giving. And then, there's something else I see commonly. I'm not being specific because it kind of, my work involves people you guys know, right, and so forth. Or even if you didn't, it just involves real people I can't really talk about like in this way. And I don't really have, along that vein, I actually am not thinking of anything really specific right now. But I don't try to, because it kind of would lead nowhere. But in practical terms, I see people having a lot of problems dealing with people when they don't need to. When really, so like either, what am I trying to say here? If you're kind of looking in the right place, then pretty much in a lot of cases, maybe I've already described this to you in a way that you can use, I'm not sure, but either someone is kind of being behavioristic, which can offend our sensibilities, but which actually makes things very easy. You just decide whether you want the actual deal or not. Or you can talk to them. Or if they're ignoring you, then that's irrelevant, right? That's not someone you're interacting with. But if you're interacting with someone, and you also might be blocked from talking to them because you're being behavioristic. You're like, I just want this behavior from them. I just want them to do it. I just want them to do this. And I hear that from people too. Why can't they just do this? Right? Well, if we don't think of people as objects, but if we think of their behavior as an object that is a representation of a whole bunch of reasons or frames or factors, then it becomes shockingly easy to get people to do what you want, because their decision on what to do is just based on a bunch of reasons. As you start to pay attention to this with individual people that you're close to, you start to see patterns, not just with them, but with like categories, distinctions. Really more of distinctions than patterns. Patterns can get you in a rut, but distinctions are always beneficial, essentially. So you'll start to distinguish reasons why people do things that you wouldn't have really seen when you're busy just seeing objects bouncing into objects, or statements making people do stuff, right? People don't do something because like an object of word, like a bunch of words that comes out of my mouth and like whacks them or stimulates them to do something. There's a whole bunch of factors, right, that all go together. One of them might be the frame they get from what I say, or the factor or the reason or the vector from what I say, or from how they interpret what I say. And even in what I say can involve a number of factors, right? Tone of voice, timing, right? You can say the exact same thing to someone on one day or in one situation, and it's not effective, and it's effective in that situation but not another, right? Sometimes if you just wait for better timing, then that's all you have to do. But overall, when you see people as motivated by a series of factors, you don't just take what people will do, and this is easily reproducible. There's millions of experiments that bear this out. See, what people do is they form an initial representation of a person, right? Like I'm talking about as an object, right? This is what our mind does this, and it's not bad. What's bad is to not understand what's happening. Okay. What's bad is to not realize that representations are representations. To think that objects have an intrinsic reality and ability to cause things. That's the problem. But it's not a problem. It's like, just like it's not a problem to talk to a representative of another country. So, if you're a diplomat or whatever. It's a problem to think that that person is the country, to the extent that they're not. Okay, so we'll form a representation of a person, and what our mind does is that representation has a big impact on how we interpret future behavior statements and so forth. So it ends up, of course, hardening or affecting our initial representation has an outsized impact on our judgments about the person in a way that's purely unhelpful, because we don't want something screwing up our ability to see frames, right? We want to go directly to where we're noticing factors and reasons, recent events that happen to the person that could be relevant, right? Things the person says they want, seeing how they interact with people to get what they want. Some people get angry quickly. Some people get kind of a victim mentality. Some people kind of plead. Some people are come across particularly cooperative, but might have a point when they boil and stop. Different things, right? As you start to look for these things as not as archetypes, but as distinctions that have a complex interaction with each individual person, also at different times. The same person can have different frames operating on them at different times, right? And again, we're blinded to so much of this because our initial object-based representation of a person or thing, or of a love, right? People develop a sense of what the object of love is, or the object that is love, a representation of love, an image, a feeling, and a sense of what love is. They form a representation of love pretty much from seeing their parents interact, typically, right? And that massively colors them for their entire life because of this problem, though. If you stop looking at objects as intrinsically causing things and realizing that they're representations of the current bunch of frames operating, and if we look to understand frames, factors, reasons in this way, then we don't get so screwed up by initially non-overlapping with reality representations, right? They're not so hardened. And so we can develop an understanding of love, or of a whole bunch of distinctions regarding love, where it's not even just one object. Remember, an object is a representation of a whole bunch of frames interacting, or like a whole bunch of vectors interacting, right? And then the mind will turn that all into one object and treat it like it's a thing that's kind of constant and does stuff. But what causes things are these reasons or frames or factors. The object literally causes nothing. Just like pixels on a screen don't cause anything. They can be made to look like they do, right? You can have a screen show a car, a pixels, right? The image of a car that bumps into a street light or a post and knocks the post over, and a fender is dented on the car, and it looks like the cause is all related within that image, but of course it's all code that's coding for it, right? It's not in pixels at all. Representations cause nothing, but thinking of them as bumping into each other, affecting and causing, is a useful and necessary shortcut or way of, it's necessary for thought to think in terms of objects, and just like it's necessary for me to use analogies and illustrations to explain things, right? But every time I use an analogy to explain something or an illustration, the idea is that that illustration or analogy contains the concept I want, but it isn't the concept that I want. It contains it. And if we equate the analogy or the illustration with the entire concept, then there's going to be non-overlap. So what we need to do is take analogies or illustrations and think of them in a way to extract the concept, which we already do to some extent. But there's a way that we don't do this as well, because on a very deep level, people think that objects cause things, and they talk and think in this way. We need to recognize that we don't, and then we'll circle back around to thinking as if they do, but constantly being open to adjusting and perfecting our representations. And that might sound confusing, but think of an analogy, right? If I give you an analogy to something, first it's good to understand it's an analogy and look to extract the concept I want. But then we go back, like with local peaks, if you heard me talk about that. Or with the berries, I'll give the berries because it's quick to explain, right? If there's, and it illustrates the idea of a distinction and what it can do. If you're foraging in the woods and there's berries that look alike, it looks like there's one category of red berries. But actually there's two types of berries, but you don't see the distinction. So to you, there's one group of berries. And then you think that berries both help you survive with sustenance, but they also make you sick, right? But if half the berries just make you sick and half of them are just nutritious, and you make the distinction, and you see why the distinction is the way it is, then you've made a huge advance for yourself, right? So I just made a point, but I gave you an example of an analogy, the berries, right? An illustration. We want to recognize it's an illustration and extract the concept we want to get from it, the idea of what a distinction can do, and what the world can look like before a distinction, the kind of mistakes that we can make when we don't have a distinction, right, with berries and misrepresenting berries as a category as being something that necessarily makes you sick, when actually one could make a distinction and not get sick at all. So berries don't make you sick. Certain type of berries make you sick. Okay. So that illustration shows the benefit of a distinction and the problem with not making one. And it also gives a sense of when we might want to look for a distinction. If we're getting sick, we might want to look for a distinction. And maybe we'll find out that there's a way to, by understanding a new distinction, get rid of the problem that's making us sick, right? So there's a whole bunch of benefits to our mind making things into objects. It's necessary and good. Just like there's a bunch of benefits in me using analogies and illustrations when I'm talking to you. However, if we lack a distinction, if we see the analogy as the thing rather than extracting the idea from the analogy, then that's a problem. However, what's interesting is that once you extract the idea from the analogy, you actually go back to thinking about the analogy or the illustration itself, right? We can think about the berry illustration. So that's what I mean by we go back to thinking about objects. Are we thinking in terms of objects? You can even think in terms of objects causing things. That's perfectly appropriate, as long as you understand that that's just a representation, right? But it works except when it doesn't overlap, right? Like Newtonian physics works except for when you get to a quantum level, but it works great for understanding you don't drive your car into a tree, right? The reasons why the car crashes don't actually reside within the representation of your mental image of the tree and the car, but thinking of it that way is totally useful. Just like if you're playing, I've used the illustration before, if you're playing a video game, the reasons for things happening in a video game, like if you're running around playing a guy that's shooting a bunch of bad guys in a battlefield, then you can think in terms of the cause residing within your mental image of running around shooting people with bullets, right? But there's no actual bullets. There's no actual bad guys. There's no actual you as a character that's running around with a gun, right? You're just obviously a person sitting in front of a computer screen, or not even that, right? But whatever. However, thinking within the metaphor, thinking within the game, thinking as if there are bullets that really cause death to your enemies, or wounds and loss of life points or whatever, is totally useful, except when it's not, except when the overlap doesn't help anymore. If your character dies, you don't want to be still immersed in that metaphor, right? You want to step outside of it. Similarly, we can get to the point, and I operate to this degree at least way more than I did before I realized this, I can say that, where we're sensitive to changing our representation on the fly, changing our immersion, changing our sense of being immersed in an analogy as real, right? So again, you can treat analogies as if they're real. You can treat images in your mind, objects that your mind creates, as real, but constantly be like one step away from not doing that and from rearranging your representation, including of what your goals are, right? We constantly get new information that should cause us to reassess the object that we've turned our goal into, right? We turn our goal into an object that we're trying to attain. It could be an event, it could be an endpoint, it could be ranking a website, it could be having a client say yes. By all of those, I mean an object, right? I don't just mean a ball, like a thing you hold in your hand, right? But we turn goals into an object that we want. But then we constantly are getting new information, new factors in life that will make it useful for us to reassess how we represent our goal. And how we represent our goal changes our actual goal, right? Because we're going to get re-immersed in our representation as reality again. We're going to get re-immersed in the idea that how we represent our goal is our goal, and that's what we want. But we want to constantly we want to have a worldview and a model for the world where we're one step away from changing that. Just like when we're playing a game, we want to be one step away from understanding that we're playing a game. We can fully forget that we're playing a game and be maximally immersed, and that's fully good up until the moment when it's no longer good, right? So we want to be like one step away from stepping out of objects as reality into objects as representations, then stepping back, thinking in terms of frames, thinking in terms of how do I want to represent my new goal? How do my goal, or if you always have kind of one goal, like you in a sense you have one space in your mind for your current goal, right? Kind of a category in your mind for here's my current goal, right? And different objects fit in there, different representations, right? And so you want that object, that representation of your goal to be maximally suited for your current reality, right? For currently what's going on. And that, and normally people don't have a model that makes it easier for them to change their goals. Instead, they get frustrated, angry, bored, upset in various ways, afraid, right, and so forth. The minute you can change your goals by having the model I just gave you practiced and kind of a part of your model for the world, it's so simple in a sense. But life is so easy, or much easier, at least relatively easy, when you have this mental model where your goal is just a representation of your goal, but of what should be your best assessment based on your understanding of current reality of what you're trying to accomplish, right? That can change based on new information, priorities, obstacles that come up, right? I don't really have a model of the world where obstacles are like an object in a certain way. They're more like new information that cause me to re-represent the goal that I have. Right? If I'm driving and I'm caught in traffic, I see that as I've gained more information about reality with which to adjust my goal. Maybe I switch my goal for now into just enjoying music in my car and enjoying my nice car. Right? And then instead of being to get to a certain place by a certain time or as fast as I can, there's no point in having a goal. A goal should it's something that's supposed to help you, affect your decisions and priorities, right? So if I can't do anything about how fast I can get to a location, then why have anything about that location really involved with my current goal, right? Like getting there. If I'm going to get there anyway without having to make any new decisions, then I might as well make my goal. My goal could shift totally differently just to working on an issue that I can work on with my thoughts, right? If we lack the capacity to do that, practically speaking, if we can't just work on something in our heads, right? I've developed the ability to be able to work on opportunities, problems, like a webinar that might be coming up, whatever, or a sales letter I'm trying to write, or whatever problem I'm trying to solve, or bottleneck I'm trying to open, however you want to think of it. Opportunity I'm trying to take advantage of, whatever. If you develop the skill or the connections, the framework, really a skill is just something you have a framework for in essence, right? The framework to do that when you need to, right? I don't have the framework to do that if I'm particularly have external factors strongly distracting me, right? But in most normal circumstances, I can just be working on something that matters to me, that feels relevant and important and interesting in my head if there's nothing else for me to be doing. And of course, not just because I'm stuck in traffic, there's other times like when I'm preparing for these webinars that I intentionally just go and put myself in a situation to do that. Okay, I'll take a break for a moment. I'll go to whoops, that's not the right slide there. I will go and look at our Facebook group when I come back. I'll be right back. Back. Also, something I wanted to read to you guys from the book Subliminal that I've mentioned before that kind of give you just another example of frames, and I'll try to give you a bit of more indication of the applications of this. But the applications pretty much involve everything you do as we develop this. And also, this idea of frames, frameworks and everything is going to be very relevant, and reasons, by the way, reasons will be very relevant when it comes to accelerated learning. Our mind is going to remember details to the extent that there's a reason why that detail matters as distinct from the general gist of what you're reading or learning, and as distinct from like how else it could have been. Like if you meet someone and remembering their name, in order to remember their name, on some level, your mind needs to decide that remembering that their name is specifically what it is rather than like a general sense of what their name is, or just a general sense of them as a person, that their name is a detail that matters. There would have to be like a reason why their specific name matters rather than some other name, or rather than not noticing the name at all. And then there's techniques for making sure that happens. But that's the underlying principle, but that principle is not going to be something you'll probably hear anywhere else in the world. It's something that I need a whole lot of other background information to realize. Bunch of hellos. Love me a bit of cutting edge, says Julie, great. Bryce says, the whole idea of seeing things with an abundant mindset has really helped me calm down with money and distinguishing it with naive substitutions like plenty, like the win-win rather than just plenty of stuff, right? Yeah. And yeah, like a mindset is like an object representation of one ingredient or one frame that can be helpful. Now, one of the issues that people have with mindset and applying it has to do with a greater idea, which has to do with how to change yourself or someone else, which is a question that people ask me in various forms. Plenty, right? If it's not an easy change, it's easy to like change within a box, but how do you change outside of the box, so to speak, or outside of like what really feels strong to another person? How do you change them out of that? Or put the opposite way, people will hear that they should have a certain mindset and then view that, if they were to have that mindset, like positive or confident or perseverance or whatever, or believing they could do something, as foot tricking. So like they're saying like, oh, I have to trick my mind into thinking that I'm confident or that I can do this, or that the other person will say yes, right? Whenever someone's using terminology like tricking their mind when it comes to adopting a certain mindset or fooling themselves or whatever, or whenever they simply try to do it and don't succeed, then that mindset is being blocked by a greater frame that's blocking it out. Like they have a deeper assumption, right? That is kind of trumping, or it's like if you're hunting in one room but your glasses are in a different room, then the fact that you're hunting in the wrong room is going to block you from finding your glasses. And then there's certain deeper mindsets that block people from adopting kind of more other ideas. And so what we need to do is, one simple, kind of overly simplistic way to put it is find common ground, but it's not just common ground. You need to find common, deeper ground from which you, like if you're going to meet somebody and guide them somewhere, you couldn't do that if you and the other person were in different places without a way to get to the same place, to get to some place where you guys were in the same physical location to start traveling somewhere, right? So there's two qualities of that common ground. One is that it's common ground, but the other is that you can get to where you need to go from there. It doesn't help to find common ground if it can't lead you or lead the other person to adopting the new idea that you hope that they adopt. With some, maybe not all people, the idea of individual property rights, if they, in one manner speaking with everybody, if they really get it, right? If they get that idea and really adopt it, then all they have to do is use that as like a boundary or stay in that place. And then anywhere you travel within that box of personal property rights, individual property rights, you'll end up with reasonable political views, right? You might have different opinions on some gray area topics, but you're still within an overall frame that's going to be distinct from either being Republican or Democrat, right? And 99% of the people in the world and United States and even more so the rest of the world. So therefore, if you get someone to buy into the idea that individuals can own property morally, which in one sense is like a no-brainer for people, right? But the odd thing, and this is an illustration of that we need to figure something out about life, which has to do with frames, is somehow people can affirm that, yeah, sure, people can own property, and yet have a whole bunch of political beliefs that they strongly hold and act on that are massively important and have a huge impact in the world that violate the idea that people can own property, right? So you would want to get them to really take a stand on the individual property rights and almost like consolidate with it to where it's really solid for the other person, even like neurologically, before you build on it. If you get them to like agree on individual property rights like for a moment, and then you pounce on them and you're like, you see, that's why this is wrong, that's why this is wrong, that's why this is wrong. In practice, if the person doesn't have it kind of neurologically solid, or if they don't have, what you can have is an even deeper idea, which I'd like you guys to have, which is kind of the very idea of foundationalism, which is the capacity to hear an idea that's new but clearly correct in some way, because the opposite has to be wrong, and because we already act as if the opposite can't be right. So we hear an idea, even if it's new, but we can use it as kind of like a universal solvent or as a boundary or whatever to adjust our other ideas. Even before we feel that idea or the other ideas, we still recognize that they have to be correct and let our feelings follow. That we design how we want our feelings to be, that we have a greater frame that, again, we can call foundationalism, which is that certain ideas can be understood to be correct, right? Like that lighting a person on fire is wrong, right? Or burning, I used the kind of shocking illustration before. People might certainly acknowledge or affirm that incinerating a 2-year-old girl at random, or innocent, obviously any 2-year-old girl is innocent, but just to make it clear, an innocent 2-year-old girl, incinerating them in front of their parents, both of whom are innocent, right? That would be wrong, like that would cross the lines of morality. And yet, by their actions, people tend to not think that, in the sense of they don't really have a sense that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were wrong, right? Because there's another frame that isn't solid, that, oh, well, if you have a group of people, then as long as we group people, then we can say that, well, if some members of the group did something really bad, then that allows us to incinerate other members of the group. And the group is like in our heads, right? Like Japanese people in the 40s. A lot of Japanese people in that time did horrible things in America and other places, right? Or not much of, on the edge of America and Hawaii, but in other places, but presumably. But it doesn't make it okay to incinerate 2-year-old girls in front of their parents. Foundationalism allows us to take an idea like that and take it wherever it might lead and let our feelings catch up. If someone doesn't have the foundational frame idea, then they kind of need to feel something before they can think it. And of course, if you are in that situation, like many people are, then you're kind of screwed, right, until you change that. You kind of have to have someone like kind of operate on you, right? And ultimately, you can be manipulated by whoever can manipulate your feelings, since they take precedence for you overall as an overall frame. We do care about feelings here. I do. Feelings are very important, just in the same way that representations, objects as representations, are very important. But they're not primary, right? Our representation should not take precedence over reality, just like an analogy shouldn't take over, and like with the berries illustration, it shouldn't take over and apply in ways that it shouldn't. It's not primary, the illustration. It's secondary, right? The illustration is very helpful and useful and important as a secondary thing. Same thing with feelings. We definitely want to feel. We want to integrate things in our mind and feel what's right and what's useful and what's correct about various skills, right? And we want to feel like we want to be able to write a sales letter on a web page by feel, kind of easily. But we do that by first making distinctions and getting frames that are correct, and then letting the feelings follow to the extent that we don't already feel it. Okay. Let's see what we have here. Just get a drink too. Clark Cooper says, David Mills, after listening to more than half of Alchemy, I still struggle with what you mean when you say reasons. Is there another word that would help me to understand that? It's a very useful question. I'm not sure how well I'll answer it here, if I'll also give it some thought over the coming weeks. In a sense, everything I'm trying to do is to explain this concept better, including understand it better for myself. But on various levels, there's results in life, right? There's the result that we experience in our consciousness screen, and then also there's just results that we can express in everyday terms, like I ranked a website, or I got married, right, or whatever. Then the real factors that all contributed to make that result happen is part of what I would call reasons. When we understand how the world all works, then we understand that the only thing that causes things directly, or causes your consciousness screen to be the way it is God. And then there's reasons why God does things, but then because we have free will, there's a way that there's something we do too that contributes to why things happen one way rather than another, right? Part of what we want to do in this series actually is by taking a look at reasons, and also there's a hierarchy of reasons, like I talked about with frames and greater frames, and like just a simple illustration of searching for your glasses in a house. If you're restricted to one room, then that's different than being restricted to a house or being restricted to a city or whatever. That's like a hierarchy of frames or reasons in a sense. Like if you're restricted to a particular house, then you can't go to a different house, right? Sorry, what I mean is frames can totally block off other potential frames. So there's as I was saying, there's a hierarchy of reasons that we can come to understand. And there's kind of lost a little bit of my train of thought here, but I think I'm close to it. Here's what I was saying, is that what we want to do in life is get closer and closer to understanding what it is that we do control, whoever we are, right? There's things in life that we control more indirectly, and things that are closer that we control directly. And where there's more overlap, just in practical terms, there's places in life where there's more overlap between how we represent reality and how reality works. And so by even like driving a car, there's a way that we kind of directly control, up until the point where our car breaks down or runs out of gas. We control that it starts and where it goes. It's indirect. There's a whole bunch of intermediate steps that we're not directly aware of, but in practical terms, we control it. Therefore, in practical terms, when we're not getting the result that we want to be able to look and see practically what do I control in this situation. And by looking at things in terms of frames and reasons rather than objects, in the way that I'm talking about here, we're going to have an easier time spotting things that we can more directly control, right? And things like that we can control more directly with our focus in our mind, right? Because we can see like reasons better when we focus in on something and kind of magnify it with our mind. So focus allows us to, when I say see reasons, understand reasons, distinguish reasons better, which when we're looking for them. And then adjusting our focus so that we notice factors and vectors and reasons and such for results, including that as we do that, we make more distinctions about that topic itself of distinguishing reasons, is closer to what, practically speaking, we can control as people. So again, seeking reasons is something very close to what we can directly control with our minds. And it turns out, it just like that's related to seeking understanding. The real hack or shortcut about how I figured out years ago that if I just measured progress by seeking understanding, in practical terms, that's such a hack because practically speaking, it's so directly under our control, just experimentally, right, practically. I can't, even separate from theoretically understanding why it's under our control, it's just, if we try to understand something, like intentionally, rather than not try to understand it, we can typically do that. We can typically succeed at trying to understand something. But that's cool because there's things that we try to do in life and we fail at. Like we try to directly, like there's plenty of times, like there's plenty of circumstances where we directly want to make sales or make a product. And we can't like do that directly very easily if we don't have the framework for it, right? If someone's new or even been in business for a while, in some cases it's hard to just directly make a product that is effective or people want to pay for, or figure out how to market it or frame it or sell it, like talk about it. So what we, either in life we're getting what we want easily, or what we always want help with is when we're not getting what we want easily. And then it turns out that when we're not getting something easily, the meta strategy is to find something related to that result that we can get more directly with our will, our desire to do, that we can affect more directly somehow. It's easier. So a meta question that's very effective in life is, what's something smaller or easier or more directly under my control that I can do, or whatever, do in whatever sense of do, that will make the goal easier to achieve. Turns out that understanding is constantly a good answer to that. There might be a more specific answer, but at least it's a great starting point, and it's always correct. It might not be the most direct or specific, but it's always correct. And so by reorienting myself constantly in life to seeking understanding and measuring progress that way, I kind of made almost everything easy for myself. I started to know what to do in pretty much any case, and develop a framework for all kinds of things, master all kinds of things, made relationship easy, made dealing with people easy, made making money easy, because you just keep repeating it. You seek understanding and therefore develop a framework for how to make products of a certain type. And that gives you the ability to make various specific products, and then that makes it easy to kind of quickly act on product ideas that you kind of get by talking to your audience that you might have, or potential audience. And then you get a sense of seek understanding about how to do sales or marketing, right? Sales are like one-on-one, marketing is like talking to a group, which is a little bit different. And you seek understanding, then you tend to get more understanding. Even if we don't understand exactly what understanding is, if we try to understand something, it tends to do something useful for us, right? And then we can turn it on itself, and we can seek understanding about understanding, which I've also done. And then we get even better at the whole thing, right? So we have more of a framework for understanding it. We understand it involves distinctions and not being blocked by thinking we already should have a framework, and not letting kind of goals kind of block us from seeking understanding in a certain way, right? Where we just want to kind of get something already, which once again, that kind of just relates to acting or thinking as if we already have a framework. In a sense, it's very simple. Like there's a certain simplicity to everything I'm saying. It's a certain kind of repetition or approaching the same kind of idea from different angles. But in another sense, it's so impactful and useful and counterintuitive that it bears working on explaining it in different ways. And there's still plenty to discover, as I notice about for myself, distinctions and such. Clark says, so is a reason in your verbiage like a principle? Not only a principle, no. When I understand a principle, I can live that principle, which affects the rewards or blessings or results in my life. Yeah. Principles are typically related to what I said about greater frames. And like if we restrict ourselves to only looking indoors for our glasses, if we lost them, then we could call that a principle that we live by, and it would provide a frame that would either make it easier or harder to find my glasses based on whether they were inside or not, right? If we have a principle like we do or we don't prioritize justice in life, I recommend not prioritizing justice. But in either direction, that can, if to the extent that we have principles that are correct, then that will certainly narrow things down, right? The principle that if you act with integrity, you'll tend to have more relationships with people with integrity and less with people that don't have integrity, right? Naturally, as far as I understand, that's correct. And so that will serve you in that way. So principles are a type of frame, which is one aspect of reasons. What else could serve as a reason? You'd think this would be an easier question than it is. Because we normally think of reasons that say in like residing objects, like forces. There's a way that I kind of at this point take this so for granted that I'm oddly having difficulty, even though it's the topic of this webinar, in explaining it further. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on this. Even just the fact that somebody had just received good news or bad news. They received news they made a bunch of money. Then that would be a reason that, or a part of that would be a frame, an aspect of a frame, a part of a frame, or a frame, depending on how you think of a frame, a part of a framework, part of a conglomerate frame that a person would bring into a meeting, where if you were talking to them as a prospect, then it would be relevant what types of things that happen to them lately that make them feel tighter on, like more like taking risks or investing, or less like doing that, more like kind of going into a shell, right? So that would be an example of reasons. Categories like whether they see you as part of an in-group or an out-group is a very important frame that has a much greater impact on people's decision-making and buying decision-making and assessment of people and all sorts of stuff. Your adoption of various beliefs of other people. So another reason would be whether you see people or they see you as a member of an in-group or an out-group. Let me read you something on that. So not a better question, but a related question would be, if you asked me, what are examples of frames? What do I mean by frames? And in addition, and then if we put that question together with the idea that a result is like a conglomeration or a resultant wave of a lot of different waves or frames, right? You take all these different frames, you put them together, and then you get a reaction or a behavior out of a person. Or whether a website ranks. It's not just people's behavior. Whether an event, I guess an event is mostly, in one sense, a compilation of a lot of people's behaviors, right, into one big event, and how that is. Or how it's perceived, a perception of one person of an event would be a result that results from a whole bunch of frames in their mind and then externally, and how that came together, right? So reasons are like a whole bunch of waves constantly interacting, splashing together. The resulting interaction interacts, forms a wave which interacts, and that keeps on happening. However, distinctions can be made in a comprehensible way where we get a sense of reasons that we look for, and then we can affect the results we want much better when we look at the world that way. And it's not, again, we, just like I constantly try to use illustrations and analogies and when I'm explaining things, in one sense, I think in terms of distinctions and concepts, but then I also talk and think in terms of analogies. In the same way, we want to work with objects, and I keep saying this, like I talked about how in a video game we can get into it and think in terms of the physics inside the game, right, of real bullets and, you know, and so forth, when of course it's all a computer game, right? We do want to think in terms of objects as representations, but then be always willing and open to adjusting our representations as we start to see flaws or incongruities or anomalies or wrongnesses, right? And hone our frameworks, our frames, and therefore our representation as well. Just like we want to be, people act as if they have cherished core beliefs that they don't want to, they feel like you're attacking them if you attack their beliefs. Instead, we want to view the world as where we want to get our beliefs, just like our representations, correct, rather than need them to already be correct. All of that makes life very relatively easy. And it's an overall way of looking at life that I can testify, and to a lot of you, to a good degree, you've gotten some of this from me already, can testify. It's terrifically helpful. Let me find something here. Here's a quick little interesting one. Okay, so first of all, there's a kind of biological visual phenomenon that our eyes have muscles and they're constantly wiggling. And normally everything that our eyes see wiggles along with your eye movements, of course, because your eye wiggles and therefore everything you see wiggles the same way, right? At the same rate, same wiggle amount. And so our brain compensates for that, and so the world doesn't look like it's moving around, even though our eyes are moving around. It's called saccades, right? Our eyes move. It turns out that if you put someone in a dark room and shine just one dot of light, then there's nothing for your brain to compare it to. And so your eye will do this. Everything will operate as normally, except that the dot will appear to move, actually, because there's nothing for your brain to compare it to. So it'll actually make you feel like the dot's moving because it appears to move because your eyes move, like your eye muscles are always moving. So again, you can create an illusion of a dot moving by shining a dot. But it's subjective because it's not actually moving, right? You're shining a light on a wall to make a dot, then that apparatus is not in itself moving. But it appears to move, but it's subjective. Okay, what's interesting is that, I'll read this. Sharif, who's the name of the scientist, showed the dot to 3 people at a time, right? So there's a group of people together, of 3 people at a time, and instructed them that whenever they saw the dot move, they should call out how far it moved. Remember, the dot doesn't move. The mind thinks it, the eye movement plus the mind make you think it moved. An interesting phenomenon occurred. People in a given group would call out different numbers, some high and some low, but eventually their estimates would converge to within a narrow range, the norm for that group of 3, right? So the people would start to match each other in this group of 3 people that were looking at this dot and imagining it moving. But here's what's particularly interesting, is that the norm actually varied widely from group to group. So it's not that when you put people in a group, they all saw it move 3 inches. Different groups saw it move different amounts, but within the group, what they saw would converge to match the group. And yet, different groups saw different things, which shows that subjective things, where there's no reality behind it, kind of backing it up, will converge our beliefs to match a group, and a different group somewhere else could converge around a different point. There isn't like an objective overall thing that people converge to, but instead it comes from like interaction within a group. He says, moreover, when individual group members were invited back a week later to repeat the experiment, this time on their own, they replicated the estimates that they arrived at when they were in a group. The perception of the subjects in group had become their perception. So that's interesting. Here's another one. We may not like people in general, but however little or much we like our fellow human beings, our subliminal selves tend to like our fellow in-group members more. Consider the in-group that is your profession. In one study, researchers asked subjects to rate the likability of doctors, lawyers, waiters, and hairdressers on a scale of 1 to 100. The twist was every subject in this experiment was him or herself, a member of the same group that they were looking to. They were one of the 4 groups. So they were rating each individual experimentee, rated each of those 4 categories of people, lawyers, waiters, hairdressers, and doctors. So they gave 4 different ratings. But they were all they were all one of those 4 professions. There was no one outside of those 4 professions. So that means all of them were rating their own group and three groups of people that were outside their group. The results were very consistent. Those in 3 of the 4 professions rated the members of the other professions as averagely likable, 50 50. But they rated those in their own profession, like if they were a hairdresser rating hairdressers, they would say waiters, lawyers, and doctors are about 50% likable on average, right? Some people like people more, some people like them less, but average 50. But they would rate, if they're a hairdresser, they would say hairdressers are about 70 on a scale of 1 to 100 likable. There's only one exception, which is lawyers, who actually rated other professions and lawyers around 50. But the guess about that is that lawyers regularly oppose each other, like in not just in court, but in letters back and forth, threatening each other and so forth, or their clients. And so therefore they didn't really get that in-group sense as much. The finding that we find people more likable merely because we're associated with them in some way has a natural corollary. We also tend to favor in-group members in our social and business dealings, and we evaluate their work and products more favorably than we might otherwise. There's another study where that proves that. I won't read it, but it shows that if you keep everything else equal, if someone's a member of a group that you feel like you're a part of, even if it's an arbitrary group of people that you're set with, you'll rate their product or their more favorably by a significant amount, which is very, very important for conversion, right? It's critically important to have the frame on your side of being in an in-group with somebody. And the following thing I've referenced, but I'll read it here, will give you a hint on how that's very plausible for you, because people potentially associate themselves with a zillion different in-groups and out-groups depending on the moment. And this also, what I'm about to read to you, will relate to how I gave you that mental model of the brain lighting up in different ways at different times, and we want the right things lit up for ourselves when we're making a sale or whatever, or the right things lit up in the other person's mind. A few years ago, 3 Harvard researchers gave dozens of Asian American women at Harvard a difficult math test. So Asian American women. But before getting them started, the researchers asked them to fill out a questionnaire about themselves. These Asian American women were members of two in-groups with conflicting norms. They were Asians, a group identified with being good at math, and they were women, a group identified as being poor at it. Of course, this is not about any actual value judgments of Asians or women, but just what the norms are in people's minds. One set of participants received a questionnaire. So one set of participants. The participants, I'll tell you, were divided into 3 groups, and they received 3 different types of questionnaires before they did a math test. One type of questionnaire asked about what languages they, their parents, and grandparents spoke and how many generations of their family lived in America. Those questions were designed to trigger the woman's identity as an Asian American, right? Just like if you're making a sale, you want to trigger the person's identity about something that you and them are the member of the same in-group. Maybe you're both entrepreneurs, for example. Other subjects in this study, another group of these women, Asian American women, were given a different questionnaire to trigger a different identity. They were asked questions about co-ed dormitory policy designed to trigger their identity as women. And then a third group, a control group, was quizzed about their phone and cable TV service. After the test, the researchers gave the participants an exit survey. Measured by the subject's self-reports in that exit questionnaire, their initial questionnaire, the one that set their group identity, had no impact on their conscious assessment of either their ability or the test. So they didn't think that it would impact them at all, right? Yet something had clearly affected them subliminally because the women who had been manipulated to think of themselves as Asian Americans had done better on the test than the control group, who in turn had done better than the women reminded of their female in-group. The ramifications of this study are just extraordinary, right? Again, that even including that shows that just thinking of yourself currently identifying as a woman, not of course you know which gender you are, or as a man, right? Conversely, could affect how well you do math. And that it's possible perhaps there's a greater frame that might nullify this effect overall. It's hard to know. But anyway, that's the experiment. So that's another example of frames, and that we want to look for stuff like that in life rather than not looking for it, basically. Clark Cooper says, I understand there is a reason my client behaves as he does, even if I don't know it. But when you say the world is made of reasons, whoa, I don't feel like I understand what that means. Okay. I'll look to develop this further for sure in future webinars. And yeah, but I do mean this. I do want to see if I can do any kind of justice right now. So it's a little bit perhaps like saying that thoughts are made of concepts. They're not made of analogy. Like we convey thoughts with analogies, but they're made of concepts. I'm not really asserting that. I'm kind of coming up with this on the fly. Or if I say communication is made of concepts rather than words or something like that. There's something about, like, people think the world is made up of material things and objects, and it literally is not at all. In very much the same way as you might probably heard me say this so many times, but that that computer game where you're running around is that archetypical one where you're guys shooting bad guys, right, in a battlefield. It's not made up of trees and bullets and dirt. There's none of that. But there's a way in which it's true that there's trees and dirt and bullets and bad guys, right? As a useful representation that can make internal sense at its own little level, it's true. But that's it. That's the only reality to that. You could also say it's made up of pixels, and that makes sense on one level, but not on other levels. In the same way, your experience is not made of reasons. Your experience, your consciousness screen, that which you're aware of, your feelings are not made of reasons. They're made of feelings or conscious, the stuff of conscious experience, right? You directly experience it. I don't have an additional word for it, right? But your consciousness screen is literally made up of what it appears to be in the most literal sense. You directly experience it as it is. But the rest, otherwise, the world is made up of reasons why you and other people are aware of what they're aware of, rather than having their conscious screen be something else. Yes, that's different than we're used to thinking, but you have to keep thinking about it and listening to me try to explain it, and I'll keep thinking about how to explain it. But it's one of my things I wanted to get across overall in this series. I need to a little bit feel my way and work at it week after week. I could have delayed doing webinars for several weeks while I worked on this, by the way. I was tempted to do that, but I thought instead I would get started, which means that while I have lots of stuff worked out, there's lots I kind of don't also have worked out in as much as I would like it to be, especially in terms of how to explain things. But anyway, that at least furthers things to some degree, and I'll keep working on explaining that to you. It's a terrific question. It really gets to the heart of a critical. Thank you. I appreciate saying you'll hang in. But you're really getting to a critical distinction, like a question of a critical distinction that radically matters. So, but it's so counterintuitive on some level that I need to keep figuring out how to convey it so that everyone gets it. Mike said, David has made millions with the soup Nazi distinction. This was a huge weakness for me, like in the sense of if someone kind of offends your sensibilities, you don't want to do business with them. Or that you kind of perceive their business or what they're doing or what they might do with you in a negative light, but a negative that is kind of deceptively negative light, instead of kind of seeing it more as it is. Julie says, that one has been tripping me up for years in the name of doing the right thing too. Yeah, you want to have correct boundaries, right? Where they're correct, but then you don't want to have these arbitrary ones that we pick up from culture and the world around us, and so forth. Like people, another example is when people talk about, like when they vote, they have to be able to look themselves in the mirror the next day, right? By analogy, when I do business, I decide if it's genuinely going to violate another person, I won't do it because of a different boundary, but not because violating a person even offends my sensibilities. It just, it crosses a boundary that I understand is wrong in the sense that it's going to hurt me and the world. Like it's a lose-lose to cross that boundary, and that's why I don't do it. But I don't otherwise have like a sense of like justice or look myself in the mirror for some other reason or that sort of thing. Like there's a way that leads people to basically make unhelpful decisions about voting. Is this look at everyone that I would read about that says that in their articles, a lot of that stuff in the, with Trump running and then with Roy Moore running in Alabama, you got a lot of that phrase. I can look myself in the mirror, right? Like all of a sudden, and this is kind of common with conservative, certain group of conservatives, they're so obsessed with sex that the idea of millions of people economically being better or worse off, they can't process that in a way that really gets the impact right, right? Ideally, we would have someone where their kind of sexual relationship character was ideal in addition to their kind of economic and social policy judgment. But in reality, one of those is much more up for grabs in terms of where there's great actual variance in economic, so like kind of socioeconomic, like not even socio, like economic type policies, right? Tax policy, regulatory policy, whether what we do about approving a oil pipeline and environmental, in quotes, concerns, because people that are concerned with the environment don't really act like they are, right? Typically some other ulterior motive or just means more money and power for people that already have it, usually. But the like the looking themselves in the mirror test just ends up in practice being prioritizing kind of their ideas about how a person should act regarding sexual relationships as far more important, or a total, no pun intended, trump card or whatever, versus when I was going to say there's very little law, like potential for law to be made or regulations to be made affecting things related to how people interact with their sexual or flirting or dating relationships. It's just not really going on right now in the government in an impactful way. As a matter of fact, to whatever degree it is, there is stuff going on overall in our country. It's towards more awareness and less tolerance of various aggressive behavior or whatever. So in terms of what the government was going to do, it was going to have to do with economic policies, regulatory policies, and so forth, and instead they were blinded by things. So there's a way that in business, though, I use that as an analogy. I'm not trying to get you to vote a certain way at this right now, but in business, and Mike testified that people will do the same thing in business, where like these little ideas of like their own pride and justice will get in the way in a way that's really totally irrelevant. Whether like it's not that pride doesn't matter, it's that it's usually just an excuse for prioritizing the wrong thing, right? It's like honor in kind of various kind of medieval settings or wherever, various cultures. It's mainly just an excuse, right, for either revenge or not thinking for yourself or just obeying like authority and therefore getting rewarded by that authority figure or your lord or whatever, right? Like it mainly just made people it was a representation. Pride was like turned into an object. There was a representation that overlapped very badly with what would actually make good decisions, right? Cultures that place this large kind of thing on honor, in most cases, unless honor means something particularly constructive, but it typically would mean something destructive. And often if you trace these destructive cultural ideas, they, by some coincidence, end up with more money or power for the people that are already in money and power, right? Because what happens is there's various cultural ideas to choose from, right? There's, like, for example, in Germany in like I don't remember what it was, maybe the 1920s or something like that, whenever Hegel was big, right? So there's a whole bunch of philosophers potentially around, but one of them was spreading a philosophy that was great for the people that were already in charge. It meant more money and power for them, right? And so who did they promote? Him, right? It's like natural selection, except for intentional selection. For the people that are in power will promote people that are spreading ideas that will disenfranchise normal, empowered, normal people, and give more money and power to the people that are already have a lot of it in political power, and basically people that the thugs, follow, right, to give them power. The various armed forces and policing that give power to the political elites, and then those elites will. So the people that are being that are going to be encouraged and called experts and brilliant by the media or by the powers that be in Germany, and it's indirect, right? It's academia will say so, but academia serves the powers that be, just as a ripple of reasons if you look at it. Right, it's obviously true, right? If you look at the effect. And again, similarly with business, these kind of ideas, there's a number of ideas that are just out there that serve people that are already rich, right, or trying to sell you something, right? Or just to give a simple example, my wife has a diamond engagement ring, although when we were first married, she had an inexpensive ring that cost like a little over $100 because I didn't have much money. But anyhow, I'm not on a crusade about this, but just to illustrate what I mean, like the idea that diamonds should be given for an engagement ring and jewelry, expensive jewelry should be given to show how much you love a woman, would obviously be something that people that profit off that would want to promote, right? It may have benefits, might have drawbacks, but you would expect that, and at least you can let that inform your thinking. And there's various ideas that are in entrepreneurs' minds that might end up as a ripple effect. It's not a conspiracy, by the way. I'm not saying that these people meet at Bilderberg and decide this stuff. It's more just a ripple effect of individually and in individual circumstances what gets promoted, right? There doesn't have to be any conspiracy for that. Matt said, I like the reference to archetypes. That statement was helpful for me to grasp your statement where you're illustrating distinctions. Good. Thank you for saying that. Joseph says, the representation of a person that we define that person or object as can build filters in our mind that everything the person says or does go through. Right. So we don't really see them or the object for who or what they are. Yeah, and what'll block people is they'll try to see someone for who they are, but they're looking for another object, right? It's like when a mother is asking what to do and someone says, trust your instincts. They're going to be, more likely correct when you're a mother. Well, just trusting your deeper feelings may be right and it may be wrong. You're kind of trading one thing for another thing of the same type. If you're just trying to see an object for the real object that it is. You need to operate in another dimension, so to speak, to get where you're trying to get to and then rebuild. So you want to rebuild your representation. You want to build representations rather than just have them built for you and going with the default that was built. So you aren't just going to see the real person directly, but if you look for reasons why someone does something and why they act in certain ways as a whole, and you also, again, understand that a person isn't even just or what a person does and says, it doesn't just come as a result of forces like and reasons in their mind. It also comes from a bunch of external factors that might be affecting them at the moment, or might be affecting them overall, and so forth, which gives you more, realistically, more ability to influence them, because when you're looking for the various gamut of factors that can be affecting them, then you're going to naturally spot some that are more under your direct control. And again, when I say direct control, I'm speaking kind of practically, right? There's certain things that in practical terms, if we want to change, we can just change them. Theoretically, something could block us, like if our car breaks down. But in reality, if I want to drive somewhere, I can go do it. Even though there's a whole bunch of things that are going on I don't know or control with my car, I can affect where I drive with my car, practically speaking, in many cases. So if I want to accomplish a goal, and I note that I can use my car and I can drive there, I can affect that directly. Similarly, there's various things that are influencing a person's behavior that if you look around for them, you'll spot things that just, again, in a practical sense, you can affect them. Bryce says, I love it. I'm working on vibrations homework where Newtonian equations of motion are null in certain cases. Yeah, I just referred to how Newtonian physics breaks down in certain cases. Instead, I have to use Lagrangian equations and linear algebra. Thanks for connecting dots. That's great. Wayne says, it took me a while, but now that I have completely let go of my own thinking and adopted frameworks, boundaries, and the corners of the puzzle idea, like in Othello, where you try to control the corners of the puzzle, or the more foundational frames, right? Things fill themselves in, and it's actually effortless. Great. So Wayne is testifying that it took him a while. Good, which I like to hear, which is useful to hear, right? In the sense of stick with it. But somehow or another, I've said enough stuff from enough angles and given enough examples and said things in enough ways and discovered enough of the puzzle myself that practically speaking, Wayne has gotten this result I'm talking about, where it may or may not be yet at perfection for myself or Wayne, but the difference is very noticeable and amazing, right? Where you've let go of your previous thinking, I guess your own thinking is one way to put it, but one way you might not want to call it your own thinking, right? But your default thinking, and adopted frameworks and boundaries in the corners of the puzzle, things just fill themselves in and it's actually effortless. So just what I say is possible. See, it's not just hype, not just me also being special, but great. We got at least one person duplicating it. This just gets better and better. Are we the only ones who know this stuff? Haha, thank you, David Mills. Yeah, again, there's certain distinctions that's wacky, and I'm not like trying to gain anything by saying this. It's more just trying to keep people from wandering off and getting confused or by other people's teachings, or just kind of not paying attention to this enough. But yeah, there's certain distinctions I think we're making here that they're not being made other places. Wayne said reasons are a cluster and need to be segregated out. Oh yeah, like separate out, like I referred to in the overall alchemy idea. Great. Reasons, influences, vectors, yeah, those are all good. Near synonyms, exactly right. Thanks, Alan. Megan said, I was totally immersed in goal, and while there, maybe you mean a particular goal. I'll see, I'll keep reading. And while there, I discovered something about how I had previously framed it that wasn't working like I had planned, so I got discouraged. So did I turn my goal into an object, like it is sort of solidified? Now, it's okay to turn something into an object, so to speak. What you don't want to do is be more than like one step away in your mind from remembering that an object is a representation, and being open to adjusting that representation, which means adjusting the object itself insofar as it's a mental object, right? And physical objects, by the time you think about them, are mental objects, right? Like, or not like they're represented by mental objects, right? So yeah, and in terms of goals, right? You realize that what you think of as your goal is really a representation of your goal, because in order to think about it, your mind turns into an object, which is fine. Objects are inherently a representation. When the object or the representation is no longer serving you because it has a flaw that could be better, it's not serving you because something could be better. There's some flaw in it, or there's something, it's not even a flaw when it was made necessarily. It might have been perfect when it was made, but new circumstances mean that it's useful to adjust it. I've been looking and looking and looking for years for a way to represent goals themselves, like the concept of goals, in a way that makes it easy for people to adjust them consistently on a fly, like they're one step away. And I like the way I'm representing it now better than anything I've done in the past. Maybe I'll tweak the representation further. And this also explains why I might tweak my own concepts without them being necessarily incorrect. But I'm trying to come up with ways to represent things that are closer to at least how things really work. And then Megan goes on to say, so did I turn my goal into an object like it is sort of solidified, more like a rigid self-image than a fluid process? Again, I think I kind of answered that in what I said. Turning it into an object is fine. Solidifying it is kind of the problem in a sense. And the rigid the rigid representation, not necessarily a rigid self-image, but or your self-image could be combined with it. But yeah, one way or the other, the representation felt real in a way that it shouldn't and wasn't. It's real as a representation. And representations can be treated real, just like you can treat computer game components like your character and bad guys and guns and bullets that you pick up, ammunition as real within its context. They're real, just like a movie, something can be real. Thor can be real within the Marvel universe, right? So, but it's real within a frame that makes it real, but it's not more real than that. It's a subframe. It's not the foundational frame. Then you went on to say, it feels like discouragement because I thought I got it right. Aha! The minute you thought you got it right, you implied that you should already have the framework prematurely. Very easy to do, very understandable. I'm not implying right now that you should already have the framework for not thinking that you should already have the framework overall in life, but you see, it was something that we already pointed out. So it's good. You already have the tools to adjust things. And then Megan went on to say, so you're saying, meaning, so I'm saying, so you're saying it's a good idea to stop and step back out to try to understand what's blocking me. And you want to try to understand what new goal, you might think of it, but what new representation of goal do you want? There's a way you can think of it as you always kind of have one goal that keeps being represented differently and keeps changing. In other words, one priority, one like kind of object that represents your priority. So you're saying it's a good idea to stop and step back out to try to understand what's blocking me and look how to reframe the goal in some way that works better and has greater impact. Exactly. And by reframe now, we don't want to think anymore like we're just putting a frame around a real object. Right? When you reframe, you're changing the kind of ingredients that go into the representation, which changes the representation of the goal. So you're changing the ingredients in terms of reasons, not ingredients in terms of a cake, by which I mean the ingredients are not objects. The ingredients are like reasons or frames. When you put ingredients together differently, or you change one ingredient, one frame, the representation can change either to a large or small degree. Julie says, this is so far from the other teachings out there that talk about being very clear about what you want. Right. Instead, I would say you want to consistently attend to having a good representation of what you want. With this understanding of the representation is necessarily fluid because we're trying to get a better and better representation. Plus, naturally, as time goes by, minute by minute, day by day, year by year, obviously our priority changes. We might, one reason might be that we achieve a particular priority, so it's no longer a bottleneck or a useful opportunity to do it again. And so it's fine to have clarity about the representation, but you don't want it to be fixed, except to the degree you want it to be, if you have a useful representation, then you want that to remain fixed as long as it's the most useful representation, right? You don't want to have it replaced by a less useful representation without you realizing it, such as if you get distracted or something gets triggered and all of a sudden your goal changes, right? A blurry goal can be detrimental, and it can be correct to say you want to have a clear goal to the extent that it keeps the representation you want fixed so you don't get distracted or triggered or meander into a worse goal. So that's the correctness about the clarity. Julie said, I've always struggled with that, as a goal can diminish in meaning over time. Then if I don't achieve it, I think it's because I didn't really know what I wanted. Right. And you do, in fact, when you look at things properly, you constantly want to shift your priorities, but correctly. There is a benefit, however, to immersion and commitment, which if you think about it is fairly obvious, but it's one of the things I plan to go over. There's a benefit and a drawback, right? Just like with a video game or a movie, getting immersed in a movie, like if someone were to say you want to get immersed in a movie and you want the screen of the movie to be in focus, that's correct, right? And you don't necessarily want like other movies playing at the same time in your field of vision, that sort of thing, right? So commitment, focus, clarity is useful right up until it's no longer useful to be immersed in that movie. It's over. There's a clearly better movie for some clear reason, right? But one useful rule of thumb to keep you from switching goals prematurely is that, kind of like the innocent until proven guilty type thing, there should be a clear difference. Like if you're looking at two piles of M&Ms, you wouldn't want to just say, let's say you think one pile's bigger, and then someone adds a couple M&Ms to another pile. You don't want to say that other pile's bigger just because now you feel like maybe it's bigger. Stick with your initial one until it's clear that the other one's a bigger pile of M&Ms, or until it's clear that the other is a better choice. And when I say clear, it doesn't have to be like, it's not exactly about perfection of clarity, but about like just roughly speaking, I'm kind of just speaking kind of practically based on things I know, that that you want like at least like a beyond a reasonable doubt. That in court cases, there's civil cases and there's criminal cases. In civil cases, some people might not even know, that you only have to win your case by a preponderance of evidence. Like if someone's sued, if O.J. Simpson is sued in a civil trial, right, for the wrongful death. I don't remember the outcomes of the various trials. I think he lost that one, but I can't remember. Then they only would need to have a preponderance of the evidence that he did the murder, that it was wrongful death, in order to win a civil case, whereas it's like a monetary judgment or something. Whereas in a criminal case, there's actually a different standard. Both of them are not exactly exact, but they do point to different concepts in a useful and relevant way. In a criminal case, it's beyond reasonable doubt, right? Which is different than preponderance of evidence. And so similarly, you probably want to use the beyond reasonable doubt for changing a goal rather than just preponderance of evidence. That'll keep you from just chasing after one thing or another and having like shiny object syndrome and having OCD and so forth. Same thing with like changing business partners, relationship partners, and so forth. Even getting angry at people, right? And if you think about it, that's kind of changing your goal, right? Because you don't start out like with a goal to like kind of a sub-goal or priority to kind of express anger and so on. And so preponderance of evidence for switching goals of all sorts and priorities and such. Sorry, I misspoke. Beyond reasonable doubt is probably smarter than preponderance of evidence, so to speak. That was a cool analogy, by the way. If I do say so myself, I often don't think of ways to express something in that way that quickly. Peter said, gosh, one day I thought it'd be fantastic to have a David Mills LOI glossary / dictionary of terms with, of course, a preface stating, if reading, all words must be constructed properly. Yet, geez, that sounds like a gross assumption of having a framework already. Still would be enjoyable. Yeah, I know. That's why I haven't done that yet. I think that I have at least either a real dream or a pipe dream or a very realistic dream, I'm not sure, of getting through kind of beta with this stuff where I've discovered a certain amount. I tend to think that I'm pretty close to that at this point, but sometimes I'm wrong about that. And where I kind of perfect the presentation aspect, the kind of the organization and presentation aspect of things, but either because I love discovering stuff and that kind of thing, or because it's just the right thing to do and I'm smart. I'm not sure which one. I'm still kind of discovering both some ideas and also how to express them. But yet I know enough that at least Wayne Quell is having a big difference in his life, which is terrific. Clark says, absolutely like distinctions or distinguish. I second that. All right, maybe I'll start to work on a glossary and see how it comes out. And maybe I won't. But I may well. That's kind of cool. I can have some words in my notebook and work on those. One thing that I do prioritize not having to happen, even though there's, it's a bit of a trade-off. But the trouble with premature closure, if people feel like they got it before they got it, of course has the problem that people might not really be still thinking and trying to apply stuff. Even if they keep listening to my webinars, there's a way that people might think they got it way before they do, and then just kind of think that because they use certain terminology, right, then that they're actually doing the new thing or have the distinction. On the other hand, if I don't give people enough closure, then it kind of, it might kind of frustrate people too much. Matt Hiller says in Robert Cialdini's book, Persuasion, he references similar manipulation studies and experiments to the Asian experiment you covered. Yeah, yeah, it's kind of a bit of an archetypical thing at this point. Just wanted to read you it word for word just once so you could hear it. The primer and impact is very interesting. David Mills, what publication were you reading from? I missed that. That's right, Leonard Mlodinov, I think is how you pronounce that, and it's called Subliminal. And there's a number of kind of related, books that are similar. There's one about, darn it, I'm blanking on the name, about a little bit like how people on the political right and left can be kind of both well-meaning and kind of a bit right and wrong. And I'm paraphrasing that terribly, but there's some title like that. I think it's in my car. I'll take a look. And it has a bunch of useful things. There's a book called Social. There's a book called Sway I've talked about. There's Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman. And I've listed these before then. There's Mind Wise, another book. Fletch says, I like that distinction between already powerful groups that are served by promoting an idea versus a conspiracy. Right, totally. The Bilderberg example, that isn't something I discovered. Yeah, once you know to look for it, it's pretty consistent. Of course, some group people will get together and try to conspire, but I personally, this is just a judgment call, I suppose, but I don't think that has a large impact on the world, or that it's kind of dictating the world. You know how I say, if they were, because the reality of the world is that it's very good the way it's set up, and so if people were smart enough to conspire really well, they'd be smart enough to get things right, and things aren't right enough. So that means that people conspiring are basically stupid in a bunch of ways, in addition to being smart in some ways. So then they might not be too scary then. If they're not smart enough to figure this stuff out we're talking about, right? Then maybe we can beat them overall anyway, even if they're trying. Suleiman said, David, how do you understand the frames which are set by civilizations, for example, Western versus Eastern? If we're raised in one of them, do you think we can think outside of it? Yeah, well, I talked about this last time, how the way to get outside of a box, or how to realize an assumption to get outside of it, is you generally need a box that encompasses it. You need somewhere to stand that'll give you the ability to see that distinction. sometimes merely talking to someone of different cultures helps you see certain things, especially if you're looking for it, not for them to be right or you to be right. People will kind of get blinded to making distinctions about religion or culture by, they'll talk to someone of another culture. Suppose you have an American, and they talk to someone who's raised with kind of Eastern philosophy, and they're like, wow, yeah, that's right, that's all right, that's all right. You know, my initial philosophy sucks. Like some people come to that conclusion. That'll kind of, the trouble is it'll look like they're seeing more, but they're really just kind of going sideways. Instead, talking to people with different cultures, they can get you to notice assumptions that you haven't seen, and then it can get you to look for a place to stand or certain principles or distinctions that'll allow you to figure out the truth of it. So first you might just notice something, and then you might need a different, more foundational principle in order to see what's correct about it. Some of the deepest foundational principles, though, I've just directly given you, like about, obviously, the basic one about winning for everyone. Everyone, you know, being well, you know, having goodness of experience is what we want. The property rights thing, not going for justice. Justice is an irrelevant idea. There may be some circumstances in which, as a practical matter, we need to stop somebody, including with lethal force, to prevent them from doing something particularly destructive in the future that they're pretty obviously going to do. I'm not like advocating that or not, but I'm certainly reasonable, like potentially reasonable, and I wouldn't call someone ridiculous for, you know, for shooting someone to prevent them from, you know, creating a horrible disaster or whatever. But justice is a totally irrelevant idea that never is a useful reason for doing anything. Bryce says, I love how Ty mentioned that obtaining positive things from each country and putting it into one would be ideal. Well, see, the ironic thing about that is that you can't do it unless you already have figured out how to distinguish what would be ideal. You still might get further ideas by looking at different countries, and I do that, and I like it, and I do it, and I enjoy talking to people from different cultures. Again, you would need to use those ideas in order to figure out a deeper foundational distinctions in order to get things right. Susanna says, thank you for a great webinar. I have to drive my son somewhere and we'll catch the replay. Great information as usual. Thank you, Susanna. It's very kind, and I appreciate that. Fletch says, is the book you were thinking of The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion? That's exactly the book. Yep. Thank you, Fletch. That was the book I couldn't remember the title of. It has some good stuff in it. I'm not saying I agree with all these authors. They have views that I might disagree with, or some things that are, you know, implicitly, you know, based on false ideas. But there's also, but a lot like cultural, a lot like what I said about culture, by the way. These books are a great example of it. There's very little difference between talking to someone of a very different culture and reading some of these books about where the mind goes wrong. With both of them, the overall worldview of the author might contain a bunch of critical flaws and even foundational flaws, but it'll get you to help potentially see distinctions and ideas that, along with foundational frames, will all go together and be very useful and helpful. Joseph said, what an excellent webinar, David. Thank you. And all the great comments. Yeah, thank you guys for great comments. Daniel says, reading a book, watching a movie, we know it is not real, but our minds suspend belief towards achieving the goal of getting to the end story. Right, we kind of get in, you know, I hopefully identify with a character or with kind of an object made out of a group of characters, right? Like if you're rooting for the Avengers, you might not be immersed from one character, but you kind of create an object, in the way that I mean it, out of the Avengers, and want them to, you know, win, or you create or you identify or create an object out of the people of Earth, and you want them to not get all killed by Ultron or Galactus or whoever. Loci, or, you know, whoever. So yeah, and you want to be able to kind of dip in and out of that in life. Wayne says, I thank you for clarifying, because I am far from completely knowing anything. I have merely, I wasn't in any way making light of what you're saying, by the way. What you said was awesome in every way. I have merely understood more, which allows me to continue, and I'll never stop now. Excellent. That's the point of no return. I've become a keen observer and less of a tower of knowledge, which ultimately collapses when the context changes and understanding reveals more. Yeah, that's another thing. As I prepare to set the stage for talking about accelerated learning, we want to be ready in a number of ways, because merely if we look at learning as we want to acquire a bunch of objects that intrinsically will help us, then we both won't see what I understand as well about. I can give you some tips that'll help you, but you won't get nearly as much from me about how to, ironically, acquire a bunch of useful knowledge quickly and efficiently. But also, we want to look at learning in an overall context of mastery. It doesn't help to just learn in the sense of associating a bunch of pieces of assertions and opinions and pieces of supposed knowledge and details. And even details are, how to do a Shopify business, with Facebook ads that might not actually work for many particular people for various reasons. Right? It might work for some, but not others. So even getting a recipe and learning it quickly might not help, because your context might not be right for it, right? Or it might be very helpful if you understand how to achieve mastery and add the rest of the context that's necessary to then become successful with that very same recipe. All those things. So as I was thinking about teaching accelerated learning, I realized that overall, there are things that it would kind of be very impoverished and kind of almost even hypey and kind of irrelevant overall. Like, it might be kind of an exciting webinar or two, but ultimately kind of not help people unless I put it in this overall context. Daniel said, your voice dropped out when I believe you were addressing my comment and then came back at the end. Could you repeat? Let me see here. Daniel, reading a book, watching a movie, we know it's not real, but our minds suspend belief toward achieving the goal of getting to the end of the story. I applied that principle when deployed overseas in a living theater, and each time I returned home, it was like an immersion of the end goal of getting home in one piece. An intermission. It was like an intermission of the end goal of getting home in one piece. Each time you returned home, it was like, just saying, analogy. Let me think here. So you deployed overseas multiple times. Each time you returned home, it was like an intermission, like almost like in a movie or a play, of the end goal of getting home in one piece, because you knew you were going to go back there, right? And so you ultimately wanted to get back in one piece in body and mind overall and be done with all the deployments. And there must have been some other goals involved to some degree, right? Or you wouldn't do it in the first place, because you could accomplish that by just not, unless they kind of got you to sign up and you wish you hadn't, which I really don't like how they recruit people that are like so young, 17 and 18, and sign them on to these many-year things where they have to obey all orders and, but anyway, suspension of belief analogy of reality. Like, is it like like a suspension of reality while you were home, or like a suspension of belief of reality when you were out there? And it's kind of like dipping into a video game and not? The movie, like the book, like the book movie, yeah. Somehow I'm not like fully understanding your question. I applied that principle and deployed overseas. Each time I returned home, it was like an intermission. Now, okay, let me say this. Overall, of course, you can have a goal, and it's represented in a certain way, right? It's like an object that's a representation. It's a certain goal. That exact same goal can be dropped and taken back in its exact same form the next day for an hour or for a year for a certain time, right? Or you could, right? So a goal can of course be fully dropped for a certain amount of time, fully replaced with something else, and then you can get it back in the exact same representation. Can come back because it's relevant again, right? So that can be. David, my wife is asking how do you have the energy to keep going for so long? I think she's jealous I've been listening. Oh, I'm sorry. Exactly. I think that's what she really means. Okay, I'm about ready to end anyway here. That's funny. But you're good at interpreting. That's a very brilliant interpretation. I think you're right about. Or maybe she's hinting that maybe it's time to stop now and listen to anything or more in the replay. But I'll end things now. I don't know. Part of it's what I eat, and part of it's, kind of getting immersed in things and so forth. We all have energy for different things. Yeah, some days I really peter out. Today I didn't. Maybe it was partly just what I ate, or maybe it's partly the subject matter or something. Anyhow, we'll end things now, and I will continue with this series, of course, in future weeks. I appreciate all the attendance and all of the participation. We had a good amount of attendees, actually. And okay, well, we'll continue. There's plenty more to say about the benefits of things and the specifics, but I'll just look to have this unfold. And the bottom line is, if we can understand this concept and apply it, kind of like Wayne was talking about, then, and to a good degree, some of you might already be there, and this will further reinforce it and help to understand. But my kind of premise for these webinars, where I'm at with these webinars, is that the overall concept is one that definitely is there. I definitely understand and apply it to enough degree that's very useful. I have some sense of how to explain it, and I will keep trying to explain it until I think we've got it. And some weeks I might do a better job. Some weeks I might do a worse job, but that's kind of the overall structure and guidance that I have. And it's free for that reason too. But I know I can help you guys to a greater or lesser degree. I know there's a bunch of unique distinctions. The whole thing about the objects versus frames and where we assign causal power, I think that that's part of also what was being asked with the difference with the reasons that you were asking. I don't know why I'm blanking out. Wasn't Matt? Wasn't Peter? Goodness. Clark. You asked about reasons. I'm going to try to directly talk about like how reasons work, like cause and effect, and how that works. Of course, I've taken whacks at it in the past. There'll be some overlap when I try to explain it again. But the idea of cause and effect, and also foundational frames, and how impactful they are, how practically useful they are, and how it must be counterintuitive to think about them because people tend not to. I want to try to hit directly, and then I want to, of course, hit accelerated learning, and then we'll see where else. Great. Yeah, I'm not always so energetic, a lot of, like, it's kind of it really applies like anything with the reasons and the frames. Certain things combine together where I seem energetic, and other things combine together where I seem kind of lazy or less energetic. Mike said incredible. I didn't even just drink coffee. I drank it much earlier today and haven't drank any right before the thing. Maybe that's part of it, though. Maybe that all worked. Mike says, incredible. I've observed and benefited from David applying this about frames since our Magic Champ days, but this was so eye-opening. Yeah, exactly. I'm kind of in the same place where, like, there's a lot of benefits I've already conveyed, a lot of ideas I've conveyed, a lot of benefit people already get, and also even with you specifically, Mike, exactly. But then there's also more that I feel like I can get, that you can get, and I'm digging for that. I feel like, I don't know when I'll get a sense of a certain type of endpoint, but I kind of feel like I'm close to something. There's already been like some major breakthroughs, like with the Ragnarok idea of removing failure conditions, right? The idea of breakthrough stacking, where you focus on breakthroughs, the way we represent business and such. But there's some other one recently, but yeah, we'll see. It might just be about explaining it this time. I need some breakthroughs about that, about just how to convey it. But it might just be, putting one foot in front of the other and consolidating and doing it, explaining what I already know. But we will see. I appreciate y'all sticking with me. It's dangerous, feeling close. We'll see. Close to closure could be a problem. I don't see it impacting my digging. I think I'm digging pretty well. Of course, you're being lighthearted, and I am too. But I agree that even if I say, like, I think I've got it, there's a certain way, like a overall frame that I have where if someone were to challenge me in a reasonable way, I'd listen. So I'm not going to get so hardened where I wouldn't listen if someone says, wait, you're off on a certain distinction or something. Robert said, thank you, David, for another mind-blowing webbing, and thanks for all the great comments, guys. I was having serious trouble following along. It's very late and I'm tired. So I just did my best to get along. See you. Thanks again. It's cool. Also, even if you're half asleep, the frame, there's a lot that gets kind of stuck in there. It makes a big difference. When you listen to it a second time, you'll you'll have a very different experience, and that can only be because of this invisible framework, right? There's a way that frames and reasons are invisible. Also, this applies to the question about reasons. There's a way that they're kind of inherently invisible, which kind of makes it hard to describe. But yeah, there's a way I can communicate it, but that they're invisible. I don't know. So I'm working on it. The best to everyone here. Great thing to say. You're very welcome, Irene. Okay, guys, have a wonderful week, and I'll see you all soon. Likely next week. Sometimes I might skip weeks. I'll see. But I'll constantly be working on this stuff, putting many hours into it. Okay, guys, take care, and see you soon.